My name is Grace Holloway. I am 34 years old. I'm a forensic accountant, and I found out I'd peaked in high school from my own sister at her promotion party in front of everyone we grew up with. She didn't whisper it. Camille, my younger sister, stood up with a glass of champagne in the private room of a nice restaurant our parents had paid for and toasted her own promotion to regional finance director. And halfway through, warm and laughing, she gestured at me at the end of the table and said, "And of course my big sister Grace is here." Grace peaked in high school. Bless her, valedictorian. Everyone thought she'd run the world. Now she audits spreadsheets. But somebody's got to, right? The room laughed. My mother laughed. My father did the thing he always does, which is smile at his plate. And I sat there with my hands folded, and I did not say anything, because I have learned that the person who reacts is the person the room decides to manage, and I was done being managed. But here is what my sister did not know when she called me the one who peaked in high school. 3 weeks earlier, the audit firm I work for had been quietly retained by the board of the very company where Camille had just been promoted, and I was on the engagement. And I had spent those 3 weeks looking at a set of numbers with my sister's initials on them, numbers that did not add up in a direction that only ever means one thing. 20 minutes after that toast, my sister's phone buzzed. It was an email from her company's head of HR and its outside counsel, asking her to make herself available first thing Monday to discuss certain discrepancies in the regional figures. She read it at the table. I watched her read it, and I watched her look up slowly and find my face and go very still, because Camille is a lot of things, but she is not stupid, and she knew what I did for a living, and she had just called me a spreadsheet auditor in front of 40 people 90 seconds before her whole world tilted. Before I tell you what was in those numbers, and what I chose to do when my sister realized I was the one who'd found them, tell me what time it is where you are right now, and whether you were ever the one people said peaked early. I want to see how far this story travels. I have to explain the two of us, because you can't understand the party without understanding 30 years of what led to it. I was the smart one. That was the family label, and like all the family labels, it started as a description and hardened into a cage. Valedictorian. Scholarships. The one the teachers called about. And for a while, in high school, that made me the star of the family, briefly, gloriously, the one my parents bragged about at church. And then I grew up, and I went into a profession that is quiet and unglamorous and invisible, and the star dimmed. Forensic accounting is not a job that produces dinner party stories. I find money that has been hidden. I follow numbers that someone arranged very carefully so they wouldn't be followed. It is painstaking, it is slow, and when I do it well, nothing dramatic happens where anyone can see. A discrepancy gets quietly corrected, a person quietly leaves, a company quietly avoids disaster. My best work is, by design, work nobody ever hears about. Camille went a different way. She was not the smart one, she was the charming one, the one who lit up a room, the one people wanted to promote. And she rose. She was good at being liked, good at being visible, good at standing where the light was, and in the corporate world that is worth a great deal, sometimes more than being right. She climbed, and every rung she climbed became, in the family story, proof that she'd been underrated and I'd been overrated. The narrative flipped somewhere in our late 20s. I was the one who peaked early and coasted. Camille was the one who was a late bloomer and soared. My mother led that reframing. My mother, who had once bragged about her valedictorian, now spoke about my career with a faint apologetic softness, the way you'd mention a relative's disappointing hobby. Grace does accounting, she'd say, and then, brightening, but Camille just got promoted again. And Camille never corrected it. Not once in 10 years did my sister say, in front of the family, actually, what Grace does is incredibly hard and important, because the story where I'd peaked and she'd soared was the story that made her the winner of a race she'd been losing when we were young, and she needed that story too much to give it up. I want to be fair, because fairness is the whole point of this. Camille was not evil. She had spent her childhood in the shadow of a sister who got all the academic praise, and she had found, in adulthood, a kind of revenge in becoming the successful one, and she used it. The high school peak line wasn't new. She'd been sharpening it for years, deploying it lightly at gatherings, always with a laugh, so that if I flinched I was the one who couldn't take a joke. It was, I eventually understood, not really about me. It was about a wound she'd carried since she was 9, and I brought home a report card that made our mother cry. cry with pride. There were 3 moments I never let myself feel until much later. At our cousin's wedding, when I'd just passed the hardest professional exam in my field, Camille introduced me to her table as my sister Grace. She was going to be somebody, but she does taxes now, and everyone chuckled, and I chuckled, because that was the toll for being in the room. At a Christmas 2 years later, my mother spent the meal describing Camille's promotion in detail and then turned to me and said brightly, "And Grace is still at the accounting firm, still plugging away," as if my career were a hobby I hadn't quite grown out of. And once, when I'd quietly caught a 7-figure fraud that saved a client's whole company, work I couldn't even describe at dinner because it was confidential, Camille said, "It must be nice to have such a low-stress job," and my mother agreed that yes, it was nice that Grace had found something so steady. Each one was warm. That was the trap of it. Each one told me exactly where I stood, in a voice too soft to argue with. But understanding why someone hurts you is not the same as agreeing to keep absorbing it. It took me a long time to learn the difference. For years, I told myself I was being gracious. I was the older sister. I was secure. I didn't need to compete. I could let Camille have her moment. That's what I called it. What it actually was, I had accepted the role of the person whose accomplishments didn't count, so that my sister could feel like the person whose did. The cruelest part wasn't the money. There wasn't any money involved. For years. The cruelest part was that they used the exact thing I was best at as the proof that I was less. My precision, my patience, my quiet competence with numbers, the very qualities that made me good at a difficult profession, got reframed as smallness. Grace audits spreadsheets, as though seeing what other people miss were a consolation prize. I found out what that skill was actually worth on the night of my sister's promotion party. 3 weeks before the party, a new engagement came into my firm. I want to be careful here, because this is the part where people assume I engineered something, and I did not. I did not seek out my sister's company. I did not ask to be on it. Forensic engagements come in through the partners, and this one came in the way they do, quietly, from a board that had noticed something and wanted an independent look before it became a problem. The client was a mid-sized company. Its regional finance operation had some numbers that didn't sit right. The board wanted a discreet review before deciding whether they had a real issue or a bookkeeping mess. I did not know, when I was assigned, that it was Camille's company. I want to be honest about that, because it matters. Our last names are different now. She took her husband's, and the regional structure wasn't something my family ever discussed in detail, because my family didn't discuss my work at all, and discussing Camille's work meant discussing her promotions, not her org chart. I learned it was her division about a day into the file, when I saw a name I knew on an approval line. And here is the thing I want you to sit with, because it's the moral center of everything that happened next. The moment I realized it was Camille's numbers, I did the correct thing, which was also the hard thing. I told my engagement partner. I disclosed the relationship immediately. That is what you do. That is what integrity in my profession requires. And my firm made a decision that because Camille was not my direct report, not my dependent, and because the concerns predated my involvement and were documented independently, I could remain on the engagement in a limited capacity while a second reviewer verified everything I touched. Every conclusion I reached, someone with no connection to my family checked. I made sure of it. I did not want there to be, ever, a version of this where I could be accused of inventing my sister's undoing. So I looked at the numbers, and the numbers were bad. I'm not going to drown you in the technical detail, but I'll tell you the shape of it, because the shape is the story. Over about 2 years, the regional division Camille ran had been reporting results that were better than they were. Revenue recognized early. Expenses pushed into later periods. A handful of vendor arrangements that smoothed the numbers in exactly the way you smooth numbers when you need this quarter to look like the quarter that gets you promoted. It was not, at first glance, theft in the crude sense. No suitcase of cash. It was something subtler and, in its way, more revealing. My sister had been manufacturing the appearance of success. She had been doing to a company's books what she had spent her whole life doing to our family's story, arranging the numbers so that the picture looked like the picture she needed people to see. And it had worked. It had gotten her the promotion. The regional finance director job, the one she was about to toast, had been offered to her on the strength of results that I was now able to prove were partly constructed. I sat with that for a long time, alone. known, in the quiet way I do everything. I remember the exact moment the numbers gave it up. A Tuesday night, past 10, everyone else gone home, when a reconciliation I'd run 3 times finally stopped balancing in the same small way each time, which is how these things always announce themselves. Not with a bang, but with a discrepancy that refuses to go away no matter how you hold it. I printed that page. I sat with it under the desk lamp, and I thought about every family dinner where my work had been called small, and here it was, the small quiet skill, telling me a truth about my own sister that no one else in the world would ever have been able to see, because I understood immediately what I was holding. I was holding my sister's whole self-made story, and I could see the seams in it, and I was the only person in our family who would ever be capable of seeing them. The party was 3 weeks into the engagement. I almost didn't go, but not going would have required an explanation, and I couldn't give the real one. The engagement was confidential, and would stay confidential until the firm's work was complete and the board acted. I could not tip Camille off, not because I wanted to ambush her, but because the integrity of the review required that no one in the division know it was happening, and my sister was the head of the division. If I skipped her party acting strange, she'd ask why, and my mother would push, and the whole careful structure would be at risk. So I went. I put on a nice dress and I went to my sister's party, and I sat at the table knowing what I knew, which is one of the strangest things I have ever done. Camille was radiant. She's always radiant when she's winning. She worked the room. She thanked our parents. She told the story of her rise, the late bloomer, the one who'd been underestimated, the one who'd clawed her way up while the early stars faded. She'd been telling that story for a decade. She had no idea that the numbers underneath the latest chapter of it were, at that very moment, sitting in a reviewed and cross-checked file in my firm's server. And then she raised her glass, and she got to me. My big sister Grace. Grace peaked in high school, bless her. Valedictorian. Everyone thought she'd run the world. Now she audits spreadsheets. But somebody's got to, right? The laughter. My mother's laughter. My father's smile at his plate. I want to tell you I felt triumphant, sitting there with the secret. I didn't. I felt tired, and I felt sad, because in that moment I understood that my sister would have said it even if she'd known, that the compulsion to make me small was so deep in her that even standing on numbers she knew were false, she couldn't resist reaching down to press on me one more time. And I understood something about myself, too, that I had spent years letting her, and that the letting had a cost, and that I was about to stop paying it, not out of revenge, but because the truth was already in motion, and I was no longer willing to lie to hold it back. I did not respond to the toast. I lifted my glass with everyone else. I said, quietly, congratulations, Camille, and I meant it as a kind of goodbye, though no one at the table could have known that. 20 minutes later, her phone buzzed on the table. I did not send that email. I want to be completely clear about that, because it's the hinge of the whole thing. I did not time anything. I did not arrange for HR to contact her during the party. I had no idea it would land when it did. The board and the company's council were moving on their own timeline, and their timeline happened to intersect my sister's party by pure, terrible coincidence. The universe has a sense of theater that I would never have dared to script, but I watched it happen. Camille glanced at her phone the way you do mid-party, expecting a well wish, and I saw her face change. I saw her read it again, and I saw her look up and scan the table until she found me, and I watched the whole thing arrive in her eyes at once, that I was a forensic accountant, that her numbers were being questioned, that the sister she'd just called a spreadsheet auditor might be holding the spreadsheet. She excused herself. She said she needed to make a call. She was gone for 20 minutes, and when she came back her radiance was gone, replaced by something brittle and performing, and she did not look at me again for the rest of the night, and the party wound down early, the way parties do when the guest of honor has quietly stopped being present. My mother, sensing something without understanding it, asked me in the parking lot if I knew what was wrong with Camille, and I said, truthfully, that I couldn't discuss it. And my mother, this is the part one keep coming back to, my mother's face did something I'd never seen, because because I can't discuss it. From the daughter who audits spreadsheets, about the daughter who soared, reorganized something in her understanding of us in real time. She said carefully, "Grace, is this something to do with your work?" And I said I couldn't discuss it. And she understood, finally, that the invisible thing I did for a living was not small, and that it had just become the largest thing in the family, and that she had spent a decade apologizing for the wrong daughter's career. Here's what happened over the following weeks, and here's what I did and did not do. I did not tell my family anything. I did not call Camille. I did not confirm my mother's suspicions. I did not post or gossip or give my sister the confrontation she might have been able to turn, with her charm, into a story where I was the jealous older sister who'd sabotaged her. I did exactly what my profession requires, which is also, it turns out, exactly what dignity requires. I stayed quiet. I did my work carefully, and I let the process be the process. Camille tried to reach me, of course. Once she understood, the calls came. First warm, "Grace, we should talk. This is all a big misunderstanding. You know how these things get blown out of proportion." The same voice she used at parties. The charm turned toward me now that she needed something. I did not take the bait, and I did not take the calls, because there was nothing I could ethically say to her, and she knew it, and the calls were not really attempts to communicate. They were attempts to manage me, the way the toast had been, the way everything always was. Then the calls turned. When warmth didn't work, she tried the family. She called our mother and told her I was coming after her, that I'd used my job to dig into her company out of jealousy, that I'd never forgiven her for surpassing me. She built, in other words, the exact narrative I'd feared, the bitter older sister weaponizing her boring little job against the successful one. And for a while, some of the family believed it, because it fit the story they already knew. I let them. That was the hardest part, harder than the toast. I let my family believe, for weeks, that I might be the villain, because the alternative was violating a confidential engagement, and I was not going to become dishonest to defend myself against a lie. My integrity was the whole reason I was in a position to see the truth. I was not going to spend it just to feel better at a family dinner. What I did instead was let the second reviewer, and the board, and the company's counsel do their work without interference, and I documented my own disclosure and recusal so scrupulously that no one could ever say the outcome was personal. I built, quietly, the record that would show I had done everything right. And I waited. The company's review concluded, and here is where the story becomes not about a party, but about a reckoning. The findings were substantiated. The regional numbers had been materially misstated over roughly 2 years, and the misstatements traced to decisions made and approved at the level my sister ran. The promotion that had been awarded on the strength of those numbers was, the board determined, awarded on a false basis. Camille was not arrested. This was a corporate governance matter, not a criminal fraud case, at least not at that stage. The misstatements were the kind that end careers rather than the kind that end in handcuffs. But her promotion was rescinded. She was placed on leave, and then, through the quiet negotiated exit that companies use for these things, she left the company entirely. And that is when I had a decision to make, and it wasn't the decision my family expected, and it probably isn't the one the internet would want either, because there was more in the file than the company acted on. There always is. In the course of the review, I had seen things that could have followed Camille beyond that one company, patterns that, if I'd chosen to make them known in the right places, would have ended not just this job but her ability to get the next one, and possibly opened the door to something worse than a negotiated exit. I held, in other words, the power to not just correct the record but to ruin her. I did not use it. I thought about it. I want to be honest that I thought about it, in the small hours, on the nights when I remembered every toast and every bless her, and every time my mother apologized for my career while praising the career built on lies. There was a version of me that wanted to burn it all down, but I kept asking myself what I actually wanted underneath the anger, and it was not ash. What I wanted, underneath everything, was to stop being the one who didn't count. I had that now. The board's findings had already delivered it. Ruining Camille beyond what the truth itself had already done was a separate craving, and I was old enough, finally, to tell a craving from a need. So I did the precise thing, which is the only thing my whole profession is really about. I made sure the truth was accurate, complete, and properly delivered to the people entitled to it, and not 1 inch further. I did not leak. mistake. I did not call other companies. I did not make sure the story followed her. The consequences Camille faced were exactly the consequences the truth itself generated, no more. And I declined to add my own thumb to the scale, even though every part of me that had sat through 30 years of being made small was screaming to press down. For a while after the board acted, the family was very quiet. There was no dramatic reckoning dinner, no scene, just a slow, awkward rearrangement, the sound of a story everyone had believed for a decade quietly coming apart in the background of ordinary life. An aunt who'd repeated the grace-peaked early line for years called me, out of nowhere, to ask how my work was going, the first time she'd ever asked. A cousin who'd laughed at the toast sent a careful message. None of them knew the details. They just felt the ground shift, and they adjusted, the way people do, without ever quite admitting the old arrangement had been wrong. I noticed all of it, and I said nothing, because I was done explaining myself to a room that had needed 30 years and a corporate investigation to start listening. My sister asked to meet me months later, just the two of us. No parents, no table, no audience. She'd rehearsed something, I could tell. She started with a version of an apology that was really a negotiation. She was sorry things had gotten so out of hand. She hoped we could put it behind us. She knew I hadn't meant for it to go so far. Even then, even leveled, she was trying to arrange the numbers of the story so the picture looked like the picture she needed. A misunderstanding between sisters, no villain, no truth, just a regrettable mess we'd both move past. And I said the sentence I'd say again exactly the same way. I said, Camille, I didn't do anything to you. I just stopped being willing to pretend your numbers added up. The ones at your company, and the ones you've been telling this family for 30 years. She started to cry, and I want to be clear that it wasn't a performance, not entirely. She said, you have no idea what it was like, being the sister of the genius, everyone always comparing me to you. And I said, I do know. I lived the other side of it, and I never once used it to make you smaller. And she was quiet, because there was nothing to say to that, because it was true. Then she asked me the question that told me she still didn't fully understand. She asked, did you enjoy it, watching me get that email at the party? And I told her the truth. I said, no. I felt sad. I've felt sad the whole time. I didn't want you to fail, Camille. I just wasn't willing to lie anymore to help you look like you'd succeeded. The 18 months after that were not dramatic. That's the part these stories never show. Camille did not vanish into ruin. She took a lower job at a smaller company, a real one, doing real work, and by every account I've heard she's doing it honestly, because the thing that had propelled her, the ability to make the picture look better than the reality, had finally stopped working, and she'd had to learn to actually deliver instead. It's a smaller life than the one she'd built on the manufactured numbers, but it's hers, and it's real, and I think, though we don't talk often, that some part of her is relieved to no longer be running from the seams in her own story. My father surprised me. He'd smiled at his plate my whole life, the passive parent, the one who let my mother set the family narrative and never intervened. A few months after everything settled, he called me, which he never does, and he said, I've been thinking about that toast. The peaked in high school thing. We all laughed. I laughed. He was quiet, and then he said, I've been laughing at that joke for years, and I never once thought about what it was doing to you. I'm sorry. I smiled at my plate. It wasn't much, but it was the first time my father had ever named his own silence, and I decided to let it count, because he's getting old and I'm tired of waiting for cleaner sentences than people are able to make. My mother took the longest, because she had the most to unmake. She had spent a decade rewriting me as the daughter who peaked and coasted, and unwriting that meant admitting she'd been apologizing for the wrong child's life. For months she was defensive, insisting she'd never favored anyone, that I was being unfair, that Camille had made a mistake but I didn't have to be so cold about it. The version where I was the cold one fit the family she'd built. Then, about 7 months later, she came to my apartment, which she'd rarely done, and she sat down, and she said, I want to say something and I don't want you to make it easy for me. She said, I spent your childhood proud of you and your adulthood apologizing for you, and I never noticed the moment I switched. I called you the one who peaked because it let Camille be the one who soared, and I needed that story more than I needed to see you clearly. I looked right at the most careful, honest person in this family, and I called her small. I'm sorry. She didn't ask me to forgive her. That's the only reason it landed. It was the first thing my mother had ever said to me that didn't didn't have an instruction folded inside it. I told her it would take time. She said she knew. She calls now, sometimes, and she asks about my work, actually asks real questions, the way you ask about something you've decided to respect. And she has stopped saying Grace audits spreadsheets, because she finally understands what those spreadsheets can do, and what it cost me that she spent so long pretending they were nothing. People ask me whether it was revenge. I didn't manufacture anything. I didn't misstate a number, or build a promotion on a lie, or spend 30 years arranging a story so I looked bigger than I was. I didn't do a single one of the things that made the consequences arrive. My sister did all of that, slowly, in the quiet, while she stood in the light and called me the one who peaked early. All I did was refuse, finally, to keep pretending the numbers added up, the ones at her company, and the ones she'd been telling our family for 30 years. And when the truth came out, I declined to add anything to it. I just stopped subtracting myself. Here is what everybody lost. Camille lost the story, the one where she was the underestimated late bloomer who'd surpassed her overrated sister. She lost it not because I attacked her, but because the story had always been built on a picture that was better than the truth, and I was the one person in the world trained to see the difference, and I finally stopped agreeing not to look. My mother lost the arrangement, the tidy family where one daughter had peaked and one had soared, and she's the only one who has, eventually, done anything honest with the loss. And I lost something too, and it wasn't my sister. I lost the belief that if I was gracious enough, and secure enough, and willing to be made small for long enough, my family would eventually look up and see what I actually was and say so. I waited 30 years for that. It never came from being gracious. It came the night the truth I'd been trained to find turned out to be sitting in my own family, and I refused, for the first time, to unsee it. I keep something on my desk now. Not a trophy, not the old valedictorian medal. A single page from that first engagement. The reconciliation where the numbers first stopped matching, the moment the picture and the reality came apart. My whole profession, my whole self, is in that one page. The patience to notice, and the refusal to pretend I hadn't. My family called that skill small for 30 years. It turned out to be the thing that finally told the truth about all of us. When I remember that party now, I don't remember the toast first. I remember my sister's face 20 minutes later, reading an email, looking up, and finding me, and understanding, all at once, that the sister she'd just called a spreadsheet auditor was the one holding the spreadsheet. She said I peaked in high school. It turned out the thing I was actually best at, the quiet thing nobody clapped for, was the one thing in our whole family that could tell the difference between a story and the truth. So if there's someone in your life who keeps telling you that you peaked early, who's built their whole shine on quietly dimming yours, ask yourself one thing tonight. Did you actually peak, or did you just go quiet and get good at something real while they got loud about something that only looked real from the outside? Thank you for staying with this story to the end. Every character and event in it is fictional, written for reflection and entertainment. But if any of it felt familiar, I hope it leaves you with this. The people who need you to be the one who peaked are usually the ones most afraid of what you'd see if you ever really looked at their numbers. Stay quiet if you want to. Stay kind. But never agree to unsee the truth just to keep the peace. Some skills don't clap for themselves. They just wait, patient, for the day the difference finally matters.